Hello.
Hello.
I noticed something interesting about your background. Is that especially for me, or am I making up a story?
No, you're right.
Okay, maybe we can start. Well, if you'd like, we can start there. And I'm not sure if you have like a script or an agenda.
I always have an agenda. Welcome to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis Show, where we transcend and include the apocalypse. This is a show about the meta-crisis and integral theory, metamodernism, and everything else in the universe. Today, I am here with Ēlen Awalom. Did I get that right? No. Awalom.
This is great.
And she is an embodied leadership coach and a socialist, basically, correct?
I'm a leftist.
Okay, you're a leftist. And the most important thing about her is that she's a person of color.
Really? That's the most important thing about me? You're being funny, I hope.
Yes, I'm being ironic. Well, in some leftist circles, um, it seems like the most important thing about people is where they fit on the intersectional totem pole.
Right.
So I'm being ironic there.
Okay, cool. Just checking in.
Yeah. So while we're on the topic, what is your race? I noticed you made a post recently about just how silly the concept is, and so you had some interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, the lines are very blurry. Um, when I'm in Latin America, I am definitely experienced as a brown person. Now, I could have indigenous ancestry, I could have African ancestry, or a common or European, but like a combination of European and other. But I'm definitely considered brown. When I am, and often identified as being Hispanic origin, I like to tell the story of it was funny because I'm a US citizen, otherwise, it wouldn't have been so funny. But when I traveled to Colombia, I was stopped twice in the airport, and they were certain that I was a Colombian attempting to escape to the US and
Mm.
pretend to be an American. So, and I heard that growing up in New York City all the time. My Hispanic friends and neighbors, classmates often told me that I looked Puerto Rican or Dominican or Cuban. And then in my current neighborhood in DC, which the majority of people are of European ancestry, I think in part due to that, people typically assume that I am also of European ancestry. So I've been asked if I'm Greek or Italian or Turkish and a number of other things. And I also remember years ago, I went on a date with a Russian guy that I met on some dating app. And he was like, "Black where? You look like you are Eastern European to my eyes." And I was like, he's like Croatian, or I was like, "What are you talking about? I am clearly a person of African ancestry." And he thought it was the most hilarious thing. And I remember that it started happening around that time. That was maybe like 8 years ago. And then when I'm around people of African ancestry, they almost immediately assume that I have African ancestry, even if they're not able to identify like where typically they think I'm a Northern African, which is partially true. I'm Northeast African, or they might think I'm from the nations that are right below the sub-Saharan line, right? So still essentially North African, but just below the line. And then when I'm around South Asian people, I remember I was getting pizza like a few months ago, and the gentleman, he was especially nice to me, but I didn't assume anything. And after he gave me my pizza, he's like, "You're from my country, aren't you?" And I was like, "What?" He looked South Asian, but I don't assume. he's like, I'm Indian. I was like, oh, no, 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 no. My family's from Eritrea. And he's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. We look alike. And I was like, cool, cool. So essentially, I wrote on my Facebook wall post about how I'm an example of someone who could be from almost anywhere in the world. And obviously, that's not true for all of us. Some people look very clearly European or very, very clearly of African ancestry, like undeniably so. And so I'm not denying that reality, right? So when I was in Mexico, I lived there for a year in 2020 until late 2021. It was a different experience for people who were very clearly gringos, like from North America, essentially, or North America outside of Mexico, than it was for me, right? So people could tell from my mannerisms and my energy that I'm an American, a U.S. American, but they still thought that I was of Hispanic ancestry. So they knew, or they sensed that they might not be able to scam me in the same way. But it was a very different experience for people who were clearly white. So I'm not denying those realities. I'm just speaking to the complexity of race.
Gotcha. So my understanding, though, is that you formerly identified as Black. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And that doesn't really feel resonant for me, in part because of what I just explained. Um, and this is very significant given that I spent a lot of my teens, most of my 20s, and a certain amount, maybe a third of my 30s, being associated with Black leftist movements, particularly in my 20s. So it's a really big deal because I heavily identified myself in that way. But I will name that when I was 24, about 2 months after I turned 24, so I want to say I think it was August 2007, I had a massive spiritual awakening. And part of that awakening, and it was spontaneous, was the realization that everything was an illusion, gender, race, all of it, like all the different isms. So it's like essentially metamodern moment or integral, however you want to frame it. But I couldn't integrate it because the people around me at that time were very resistant to what I was sharing.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends were hippies, spiritual folks, artists, primarily people of African ancestry, and primarily people who identified as women. And there was a lot of resistance to what I was saying. So I kind of buried it. And it wasn't until the fall of 2018 when I went to Elen, and I had encountered integral theory and spiral dynamics and all of that years before, but I hadn't really delved into it. And when I was there, I met some people who really helped give me some essential information that helped me comprehend the connection between my spiritual awakening, my embrace of post-Blackness, and the notion that it was a developmental issue as well, not just spiritual development, but also a psychological developmental issue.
I see. Interesting. Post-Blackness. So is that Siri? Just go away, Siri. Post-Blackness. Is that a thing?
Yeah. So in what's considered artistic or cultural metamodernism, that's been a thing for a while. I would say at least almost going on 2 decades. If I'm not mistaken, at the Studio Museum of Harlem, Thelma Golden, the former chief curator there, had an exhibition that was very controversial on post-Blackness. And this was at least 15 years ago, if not more. So that notion has been around for quite some time, and there are artists with whom I was close in my 20s who tried to explain those to me. But again, I was kind of all confused, right? I had this spiritual experience. People were pushing back on me and saying, well, how can we be post-Black in a world that's still deeply racist and vilifies Black people? Like, what are you saying? And then I think Obama even touched on that, and there was like, it touched a nerve. And so, but like finding integral theory and spiral dynamics helped me realize that it's about transcending and including. So we don't deny reality, but we also work towards shifting to a new paradigm and talking about and understanding complexity, right? So I'll give you an example of what post-Blackness looks like in action. There is someone that I used to be close with, who identifies as a Black person, and they were having difficulty navigating the healthcare system, and they would come to me and say, "Hey, such and such and such happened, and I am feeling really discriminated against. And isn't it so wrong that they're treating me unjustly because I'm a Black woman?" And mostly I would just empathize. But what I wanted to do, and what I think I ultimately did, and it was part of the rift that ended our friendship, was to ask, hey, is it possible that there are other things going on? We're in the middle of a pandemic. And medical providers are extremely overwhelmed. And there are all these different factors. And their argument was one that I consider a postmodernist one, which is that the entire system is patriarchal and white supremacist. So yes, they are absolutely being racist towards me. There's no moment when people are not being racist towards me. And I think the metamodern perspective would be that, no, there are always many different potential reasons why things are unfolding the way that they are. And also, we don't necessarily even have to figure out what the reasons are. We can just address what's happening without adding all these layers, projecting all these layers of meaning onto the moment, right? So we can still advocate for ourselves and say, hey, I don't like what I'm experiencing here, without creating a whole story around it. And I think that's how we start to unravel the story, the false narratives surrounding race and gender and all the other isms.
Yeah. That does tend to be a problem of like having this interpretive framework that sort of just views everything as systems of oppression. Yeah. But that's not necessarily like Blackness to view things that way, you know?
Exactly. That's why I said, but I was just giving you an example as it relates to some race and gender, like what that looks like. But of course, like that's what I said, this could pertain to any kind of ism. But in my opinion, at the postmodern or green stage of development, people tend to view everything through the lens of systems of oppression. And I would say at higher levels, stages of development, you're able to integrate that might be a possibility and that those systems do exist, but that there are other truths as well.
Right.
It's not so.
So in post-Black, what is being transcended other than just this notion of viewing things, this actual postmodern notion, and not necessarily a Black notion that everything is systems of oppression?
I mean, I like to give examples. I think for me, part of that is that the way that I develop friendships, the way that I develop connections are not the way that most people who identify strongly as Black do, which is that they're like, oh, you're Black, I'm Black, we're into the same music, we're into this and that, therefore automatically we'll be friends. Or, oh, you're a person of Eritrean ancestry, I'm a person of Eritrean ancestry, like we have a shared culture and that binds us. For me, the way that I determine if I want to be close to anyone, regardless of their ancestry, is if I feel that they are sufficiently mature, right? That I'm not going to have to be doing a ton of emotional labor to be close to them. And that doesn't really have anything to do with your ethnic background, in my opinion. So I would say that's one difference, where at the postmodern stage, it's very much about like ethnic enclaves. And I'll give you an example. There was one person uh, whom I was close to a few months ago. And when I mentioned, that I'm here in DC and that I do have some friends and I've got some family, they were like, well, what about your community? And I was like, what community? They're like, your community. And I was like, what are you talking about? They're like, your Eritrean community. And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, well, I mean, and so that is commonplace with people who are orange or green or even earlier stages of development. There's an assumption that shared ancestry is the foundation for a sense of kinship. And that's not true for me.
Right.
So post-Blackness as well.
But not at all?
Not really. In part because there's so much trauma in that lineage, and my attempts at being close to people who share my lineage have been fraught with all kinds of conflict. In part because of there are all sorts of nuances that I don't understand. Likely due to the fact that I've been so removed from that specific community since I left home at 18. There are all kinds of subtle things and things you're not just supposed to say and do, and all kinds of rules and conventions. And as someone who's neurodivergent, it's very exhausting for me. So it's much more likely that I'll get along with people who are neurodivergent or people who've done a lot of developmental work, personal development work in general, but especially developmental psychology work, than it is that I will get along with people who share my ancestry, in part because of that.
Gotcha. Because, there are some people now who have some integral familiar people who feel like we've sort of rejected too much of the ethnic background and, more traditionalist frames. And more traditional senses of identity. So we've done a lot of transcending, and not enough including.
Yeah. So for me, I was the president of the African Culture Club in college. I spent a lot of time learning about Eritrea and its history and its culture. I did a lot of that work in my teens, and really from childhood. My parents essentially indoctrinated us, and I mean that in a loving way, with the history of Eritrea and its people, and specifically of our particular lineages. So I don't feel the need to do that. What I have been re-exploring is like the aspects of Orthodox Christianity and Judaism that I want to incorporate into my spirituality, and how I think my rejection of those in my 20s might have been detrimental. So I do think there are aspects of our lineages and our culture and our traditions that it's important to incorporate if they feel resonant for us. But like I said, I usually feel more resonance with people based on shared values, shared interests, and shared commitment to development versus shared ancestry.
Makes perfect sense. So, and you, go ahead.
Sorry. Whereas like, especially for my friends who are, whether they're like Afrocentric, which I consider to be like an orange movement. That's where you have ideas about like Europeans not being part of the human race, and there are all kinds of things. I want to be very careful because there are also, you know, it's a very, actually maybe edit that out. I don't want people coming for me. But anyway, for people that I've known who identify strongly with their Blackness, Black solidarity, the Black family, the Black community, the Black nation building, like that is the at the heart of how they view themselves and move through the world. And I think post-Blackness is about what we just described. You are integrating aspects of your culture. You've done some of the not obviously not all, we're always on a journey, some of the decolonizing work, a lot of the unlearning, but you also realize that there's something deeper, spiritually speaking, metaphysically speaking, and in other regards. So just to completely answer your question about post-Blackness, I hope that wraps it up.
Gotcha. So you personally knew the founder of Black Lives Matter, is that right?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of meeting Alicia in my early 20s when I was an activist. I was associated with an organization called the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, which I still deeply respect, but have not been a member of in many, many years. And Alicia is one of the co-founders of BLM. And then I also had the pleasure of meeting Patrisse Cullors about 7 years ago, or being connected with her. And I, to this day, it was one of the most wonderful working experiences of my life. We collaborated for a couple of years on a tech product called WeRide that was essentially a social networking platform for people doing social change work. And we raised money from Google Ventures and private investors and had a small team of folks working on the product.
Cool. Do you have any opinions on the Black Lives Matter?
I'd rather not comment. Like I said, I've been removed from activist spaces for a long time. I haven't been an activist since 27.
Okay. So we'll move on. So you mentioned sort of exploring more of Orthodox Christianity and Judaism. Were you raised with any religion?
So my father is an atheist, a lifelong atheist. And my mother, when we were growing up, was not very religious, but we were baptized into the Coptic. I was baptized into the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is the Egyptian branch, because at that time the Eritreans did not yet have their own church because Eritrea was not yet a sovereign nation. But my mother now is a devout Orthodox Christian. And I did spend some time in my late teens exploring with an Orthodox priest and learning from him about the faith as I was figuring out what I believed. At that time, I had shaved off all my hair and I was a Buddhist and a vegan, but I was just trying to figure it out. So I was pretty much open. And I learned a lot from him, but I think I just didn't have, I did not yet have the patience and the discipline or the understanding of why, essentially about all the wisdom that lied within those traditions. I also felt, as someone who was really coming into her Black feminism in a completely new way. So I started identifying as feminist when I was a kid and reading like intersectional feminist literature pretty much since the time I was like a little, like a youngster in New York City. But once I was away from home, then I really started reading like gorging all the Black feminist literature. So it felt like it was at odds with my resistance to the patriarchy, like hearing things like, oh, men and women have to sit separately, and women are not able to go to the I'm trying to remember I think it's in Aksum. There's some kind of holy scripture. I want to say, I can't remember the name of the holy scripture, but like only men are allowed to go in and look at it. And so things like that did not mesh well with my embrace of anti-patriarchal ideologies. So I stopped doing that. I stopped meeting with him. I met with him for a few months. Maybe it was 4 or 5 months when I was 18 and 19. But a few things have happened, especially over the last 6 years. So I just turned 40 2 weeks ago, or a week ago. And I've been assessing the decisions that I've made. And I'm not partnered. I don't have any children. Things that are really taboo in the culture that I grew up, in the culture that I was partially raised in. And it's not that there weren't opportunities to do so. Particularly in my early 20s, there were people, men who were part of the Eritrean community who were often deeply Orthodox Christian who would have happily made me their wives, right? Men who had lots of means and all of that, but for a range of reasons, I wasn't interested. And so I've been especially as I embrace complexity thinking, I've allowed myself to reevaluate the decisions I've made, and whether they were coming from a space of trauma or a space of individuation, to use the Jungian terminology. So I actually have been considering converting formally to Judaism. My ancestors are Jewish, but mostly have been Orthodox Christian for a few centuries. Because there's a lot in Judaism that feels really, really resonant for me. And I think delving more into integral theology will probably help me. And I think there is a person, their name escapes me, who's associated with integral theology, whose work I'd like to explore more deeply. But all that to say, what was your original question? I'm sorry. I got so carried away.
Just curious about your religious background and, your trajectory with religion now.
Yeah. And I will add that I embraced Eastern spirituality when I was a kid, when I was about 12, and began reading everything from French existentialism to Buddhist psychology and all of that when I was quite young.
Gotcha. So you mentioned being really into Black feminism, and where are you at with feminism now?
So similar to being post-Black, I identify as post-feminist.
What is that?
So for me, that means that I think the feminist revolution was really, really important, still is important. And I'm deeply grateful to all the people that came before me, who worked towards the liberation of women. However, I think that, I shouldn't say I think that, I had an ayahuasca experience in the...
You had a what experience?
Late fall. Ayahuasca experience in the late fall of 2018, that answered questions that I'd been asking about gender, and about what it meant to be post-feminist and to embrace the idea of the divine feminine. And I'm going to keep it brief because it was a really transformative experience, but we could be here for hours talking about it. But part of what happened for me was about 3 hours into the journey, I was taken through the history of Homo sapiens, starting from the beginning, and for men and for women. And what I was able to feel and witness, it was like a book or like not even a book. It was like watching a movie, but at a faster pace. And I was able to see the wound of the masculine, the various wounds of the masculine and the various wounds of the feminine. And to realize that that the story isn't so simple. This notion that women have always been oppressed by men it's more complicated than that. That whereas, according to my lessons from ayahuasca, oftentimes men use their physical, their the fact that they were much bigger and more and stronger, more powerful, to dominate nature, to dominate, women and children. But that was something that, one, was evolutionary, right? And two, was them basically trying to do their best to survive in really, really brutal early human circumstances. So that was one part of it. And then likewise for women, because of their, because again, they were living in really brutal environments and had to be reliant on men for protection and other things that they needed, other essentials, other resources, learned different ways of, different means of exerting control and domination, typically through emotional, they use various emotional strategies. And this is, I'm trying to speak carefully because of course it's a very dicey topic. But what I basically saw, and I hope this doesn't sound too kumbaya, was that people were basically trying to do their best in really difficult circumstances in order to survive. But that also, it didn't excuse the patterns that we had learned, and that it was time to unlearn that, to unlearn those paradigms. And that the idea that women were the oppressed and the victims and that men are the bad guys, based on my belief and my understanding, is false. Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Do you have anything to say or add? Or I have a feeling that if people tune into this, that there may be some further follow-up questions that they have.
Well, that is always a hot topic. But I think, the people watching this will be more inclined to agree with you if they've made it this far.
Okay.
If they haven't already reported this video to YouTube for hate speech, then I think you'll find them largely agreeable.
Awesome.
So, okay, your parents were, let's say, radical or radical leftists. Is that accurate? And so that influenced a lot of your thinking, and so you were basically raised with an appreciation for Marxism. Is that right? And that's sort of the inspiration for my background here.
Yeah, for Marxist feminism, anti-colonial thinking perspectives, which I now understand to be rooted in Maoism. So all of that, the ideas of like race, class, gender-based oppression, and the importance of advocating for those, for everyone, essentially. That was part of my early education from my community.
So Marxism is really interesting because Marx does show an awareness of like developmental stages. And that's one thing that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, but which I sort of learned from Corey Davos with Integral Life. He had this whole, like, I don't know, 8-hour conversation with, or wait, maybe that was another one, but it was a long conversation with Ken Wilber about the value of Marx. And so I know you have some things to say about that and how that actually made it easy for you to embrace integral theory.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to me when I hear critiques of integral being some white colonial ideology by people who consciously or unconsciously have adopted Maoist thinking in their embrace of post-colonial feminism, which they use to critique integral theory. And Maoism is also stage theory is an essential part of Maoism. So that's one thing that I've tracked. And as I've mentioned, I've been dealing with, I'm not sure if it's part of the recording, but I've been dealing with various health issues for a few years now. So I haven't really been involved in some of the conversations. I've just been watching from afar. But for me in particular, the idea that some cultures, some societies are more advanced than others, it didn't trouble me, in part because, you know, my parents in the 70s and 80s, like many of their counterparts, were Maoists, you know, and also I understood that it didn't mean that someone was inferior or superior. There were just different stages. And so I think that sometimes when there are critiques, that folks are projecting their own ideas of hierarchy and the significance of hierarchy onto integral and developmental or other sorts of stage theories.
Gotcha. So I was really curious about, you said post-colonial feminism is Maoist.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all of that came out of there were very, very serious campaigns that the USSR and China developed in their attempts to win the war, the Cold War, against the United States. And part of that was these theories. Because, in my opinion, I know this is controversial, they were figuring out how they could divide and conquer. And so while there's a lot of important truth in post-colonial feminism, a lot of many significant learnings that come out of it, like many other things, or like most other things, there's also some murky history. And in my opinion, the USSR did not have, it's not because they were suddenly concerned with the plight of oppressed people of color around the world. It's because they wanted to dominate the world and defeat the United States and the Western powers.
So this critique of colonialism, yeah, this was sort of established to sow division?
In part. I'm being really careful because there's also, like I said, significant learnings that came out of it.
Right.
But at its root, my belief is that it was part of the cultural campaign to defeat the United States. And even like Cuba, right? Like, so Cuba, the USSR, former USSR, China, this was something that grew out of their revolutionary movements. And again, I want to be careful because women in those countries were fighting for their rights. They're like, okay, fine. So you told us we were going to have a socialist revolution, but we're still being paid less than men. We're still doing all the work in the household, you know, and I'm not being compensated for it. So there were very legitimate critiques that came out of it, but the way that it was able to spread so widely across the globe, in my opinion, was a deliberate strategy. But furthermore, what I'm saying is, I think it's ironic that those who critique developmental stage theories, in part because of their embrace of post-colonial feminism, are not drawing. They're not realizing that inherent in post-colonial feminism is an embrace of stage theories, of Marxist stage theories.
Okay, why don't you talk more about Marxist stage theory?
That's really heavy. I think maybe for another time. That's like a long.
Well, is there a light treatment of it? Like, so Marx conceived of basically this sort of like historical trajectory, right? And he conceived of like different stages of capitalism.
Or even pre-capitalism, yeah.
So there was pre-capitalism, capitalism, and then post-capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that consisted of the proletariat revolution. Yeah. Um so then what is late stage capitalism?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about that, but it feels kind of separate from our conversations about integral. And also I feel like your audience probably is cognizant of like the excesses and the destruction
So
wreaked
basically,
by late.
so late stage capitalism is just like capitalism at its worst, and it's like its final form. And we kind of, and supposedly now we're in that late stage capitalism condition. I mean, from a different perspective, you could just say that's sort of modernity, right? Like that, it's like modernity run amok. Like we're alienated from the spiritual dimension, which Marx wasn't really into. He was more of a materialist, right? Um, but but actually, I mean, one way to look at the problems with late stage capitalism is actually late stage modernity and materialism, late stage materialism, you know, like
Yeah.
advanced materialism. And so the solution may not be to overthrow. I mean, we do need, from a green perspective, we do need awareness of the, let's lower classes, and marginalized groups, but there also needs to be this like return to spirit.
So for me, I think I agree with those, but I have an additional analysis, and this might be a good segue into talking about embodied leadership, which is that about more than a decade ago, I was fortunate enough to encounter the work of Jeff Brown. Jeff Brown is a leading spiritual author. He's published, I think, over 7 books. He's based in Canada, and he was a student of the late psychoanalyst and somatic pioneer in the field of somatic psychotherapy, Alexander Lowen.
Uh-huh.
And so as I, over the last few years, I've really embraced myself or sorry, not embraced it. I've gone full force in understanding somatics and also reading the works of the earliest folks in that space and the folks who, at least in Western psychology, developed.
Who do you consider like Reich? I mean, Lowen was a student of Reich, correct?
Reich, and Brown was a student of Lowen. But essentially, my understanding is that their argument was also a Marxist one, but that revolution could be found through healing somatically. And that people of all classes and backgrounds were traumatized, but that those who were at the seat of power, the ruling elites, whether they were the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie, typically experienced tremendous amounts of dissociation and other sorts of maladies. And they were actually deeply miserable on the inside. And so, in my opinion, that's a much more compassionate lens than let's just kill them all and murder them. I don't agree with that stance anymore, fortunately. I actually think that people are waking up. Jeff Bezos' ex-wife is one example of someone who I have a story that she's done a lot of therapy. And that was why she married a high school teacher after she divorced Bezos. She also divorced that person because maybe she realized, like Reich and Lowen, that just because you are a working class person doesn't mean that you're not also traumatized and messed up. That is probably much milder than that of someone who likely has psychopathic tendencies in order to build that kind of multi-billion-dollar empire, right?
Yeah.
So yes, I hope that that explains a little bit more of my current thinking.
So that's really interesting about overthrows through embodied healing, when that kind of gets into the notion of false consciousness, which, Marx mentioned it, but didn't really elaborate on it. And after the Marxist revolutions sort of failed, and the Marxist theorists were trying to understand why, and one of the main conclusions that they came to was that the proletariat were suffering from false consciousness. And then came, I guess, Leninism, which was about, basically, it was this sort of, from my view, an elitist notion that those of us with critical consciousness, right, meaning we're aware of systems of oppression, we have to take power in order to, create in order to facilitate the revolution for the sake of the proletariat who aren't aware of how oppressed they are. Okay, we are frozen.
Sorry about that. Apparently, my spirit guides do not feel it is aligned to talk about Marxism, Marxist Leninism. I can't even talk right now. See, they don't even want me to say the word. They don't want me to discuss Leninism.
Okay, we won't discuss Leninism, but I just think it's funny that the left professes to care so much about the working class, but the working class themselves tend to be very conservative and right-leaning. And it was,
Go ahead,
and their explanation for this had to do with false consciousness.
I actually think that there might be a developmental link. So it's usually people who, like, at least in the US, they talk about coastal elites. And so often people who've had access to prestigious educations arrive at certain conclusions. Whereas, for instance, I can talk about the Eritrean case. A lot of them who support the current Eritrean administration also tend to be really extreme Trump supporters. And many of them never went on to higher education or struggled to even complete high school. And I would say that developmentally, they tend to trend towards really toxic red and a bit of orange and some green, but really, really intense, aggressive energy. And so I think that sometimes when people have less means financially and educationally, then they don't have perhaps the time, energy, and resources to invest in personal development.
And so they're more drawn to these sort of strong leaders.
Yeah, like people who I was chatting with someone who identifies as like, I think, a somatic teacher, and they were beckoning me to speak more from my pelvis and be more forceful and aggressive. And I was explaining that they were projecting onto me because I came from communities where people were like that a lot. And I myself had to heal and unlearn a lot of that, because I think it is an important developmental stage, but don't assume that the person you're seeing in front of you is just like a repressed classic American WASP, right? Like this is someone who's like arrived at this stage after a lot of personal development work and embodiment work.
What does it mean to speak from your pelvis?
Oh, well, like essentially the argument in somatics, especially I would say postmodern somatics, is that a lot of us, especially in the West, particularly in the US, live from the head up. We're very cut off from the rest of our body. Sometimes we might be in our heart, but we're definitely not on our pelvis. The way that people in the East, particularly in India and China, might be, right? And I can hear that argument because in my experience, people from those cultures generally, I'm talking about billions of people, so I want to be really mindful, but generally tend to be much more forceful. And I experience them as being a bit aggressive, right, with their energy. And I've noticed a number of people who either have learned somatics from postmodern teachers or are themselves somatic teachers who are largely at stage green. You may notice that they seem to show up in really aggressive ways, or ways that I experience aggressive. And I'm working to like heal my judgment of that because I think it's important. But my understanding, based on like reading mostly white men, somatics teachers and psychotherapists, is that yes, you do need to discharge your anger. Anger is a very healthy emotion, but you're not supposed to discharge it onto other people. You're supposed to like release it either with a practitioner or on your own through various exercises. Like you don't just like vomit it all over people.
Right. So when we talk about the pelvis, okay, we're talking about there's a few centers there.
Yeah.
You know, there's the chakra system, and then there's the sort of three center system, like, and so we're talking about the pelvis. Like, which center do you see the anger originating from?
Well, I worked with a Mexican acupuncturist for about 8 months and a Chinese one before that. And they like to tell me that I was angry. And I was like, oh, what are you talking about? Are you projecting? But based on their understanding, I think it was like my midsection and my kidneys and things like that. They told me that I carried a lot in my, what is that? That's not your sacral chakra. It's
The root chakra?
Your root chakra. And that does, I don't know that I would agree that I carry a lot of energy, but I know I have root chakra issues without a doubt.
Gotcha. Because the sacral is typically, I mean, it's associated with sexuality, but also, I guess, just emotional expression, and the free flow of emotion.
Yeah.
And so that may be where that notion of speaking more forcefully comes from. It's just like speaking with more emotion.
Exactly. And I understand that, but I'm someone I was way, way, way intensely that way all the time. And for me, as I became more regulated in my nervous system, I didn't really show up that way anymore, you know?
Yeah.
So for me, my experience was that, oh no, those folks are, based on my observations and my reading, usually that's dysregulation when people have all those fluctuations, those emotional fluctuations.
Gotcha. So I like that whole notion of the revolution is inside. And that brings in this more, let's say, teal or yellow kind of individual development, working on yourself, developing your own consciousness. And so you do this thing called embodied leadership coaching. So why don't you tell us more about that?
So to be clear, I'm just now over the last 6 months um, con- uh, continuing work on this very, very important project. It's my baby. And I've been very carefully and thoughtfully building it and reflecting and healing myself so that I could show up in the way that I want to show up. But um, after I left activist spaces and political movements, I was a wreck. I was not really okay. I was engaged in heavy spiritual bypassing. I had a lot of dissociation going on that I called spirituality. I had really shown up in ways that were quite toxic as someone who played a leadership role in a number of organizations, someone who was not just Malcolm X grassroots movement, but I was like one of the leaders of the Black Radical Congress, which was at that time a very prestigious leftist organization of people who were anarchists and socialists and you name it, just like Black leftists, including a lot of public intellectuals and such. But yeah, as there were a lot of things that were going on for me, and essentially I had a lot of unresolved trauma, like most of us. But for me, it showed up in ways that when we were talking about people who really speak from their quote unquote pelvis, I did that all the time. And I let my emotions just run. But that can be really dangerous when you are in those spaces because it can cause a lot of fractures, and people who maybe don't have good motivations, good intentions, can come in and quickly divide and conquer. So my my own unresolved issues were not just impacting me, they were impacting people around me. And it was not too long after, maybe a couple years later, that I found Jeff Brown's work and subsequently started therapy. Finally, thank God, hallelujah, when I was about 30. And that began the long, steady, slow process of allowing myself to not just be on the path of ascension, but allowing myself to actually be here and releasing my resistance to being incarnated, to my physical presence. And acknowledging all the patterns that I was holding that were not serving me and not serving others. And through that process, I had a lot of revelations, some of the revelations that we've discussed about gender and race and class. And I grew tremendous compassion and empathy for everyone, regardless of where they were at, regardless of what they believed, regardless of what they had done, right? And in so doing, realized, I began coaching when I was in my mid-20s. I think I was like 25, and realized, okay, now I'm actually healthy enough to support others again because I had to take long breaks. I took a break I was also an exhibiting artist for a number of years. There were all kinds of things that I did in my 20s, but when I realized how unwell I was like, oh my God, all I need is a job that will pay my bills, that feels aligned, and to tend to my well-being because I'm not well. But as I have become healthier and healthier, now it's really obvious to me that, oh, I was shaming the heck out of myself when really I'm just a product of our society. And I was someone who acted out much more. So it was really apparent that I was dealing with mental health issues. But that whether it's apparent or not, the majority of people around me are dealing with the same problems. And it's not always, there's a spectrum and there are different conditions, et cetera, but that the majority of us are dealing with unresolved trauma. And so I started learning. I went back to studying different holistic wellness practices and somatic psychotherapy. I spent over 15,000 hours studying trauma, a lot of that attachment or developmental trauma, but other types of trauma as well. Essentially I came to the conclusion that part of the reason that all the various attempts at revolution, all of the brilliant theories that people have come up with, all of that, part of the reason that they have not succeeded is because usually the people who develop them and the people who end up being the people who adopt it, but also the people who are in leadership roles are usually not well. They haven't done their own healing work. And so, and that, whether it's, the Maoist revolution in Eritrea, whether it's Cuba, whether it's integral theory, right? Like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, most of us are not well. And I want to be really clear that I'm not saying that. I don't want to create more shame for our listeners, right? But my belief is that all the other things matter too, all of the systems thinking, all the theoretical work, all the research, the writing, all of that, the dialogues. But what is usually missing is people's own capacity and willingness to heal themselves. And as someone who, I don't know that I'll ever be fully healed. I don't know that any of us will ever be fully healed. But as someone who has done a lot of that, I do think that is one of the main ways that I want to contribute to the unfolding of our evolution. And so part of that is working with hospitals and healthcare providers, because being in the medical industrial complex, to use my postmodernist terminology, is realizing, oh my goodness, initially I was really, really mad. And then I just felt overwhelming compassion because as I've been on this journey of recovery from various injuries, I have also done a lot of my own embodiment work. And as I've done that, I'm able to notice, to track people's patterns much more quickly than I was. So over and over, I'm realizing the medical support staff, the doctors themselves, like the entire institution is full of really traumatized people who are just trying to do their best. Even when they're being harmful and they're being jerks, like they're still actually doing their best. And also having a trauma-sensitive approach to healing and healthcare could play a really big role. So the traditional leftist perspective is to really have like a really intense critique of like the insurance companies and the various costs associated with it, the price gouging, the cost of prescription medicine, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are legitimate. All of these things are legitimate. But at the end of the day, it's the humans that are developing the traumatized humans, usually like the people who are developing policies and incorporating practices that harm the majority of us are really, really unwell. I don't want to say always, but in my experience, they're very, very, very unwell. And so that's one of my target audiences, is working with healthcare providers. The other is that I've been in the tech industry for over a decade now, and had a chance to be really up close and personal with various figures. And again, as I have healed my own trauma and my own shame and my own anger, I realized, wow, it doesn't matter if you are worth $100 million. Most of these people are still profoundly insecure and never think that they're enough. And also feel that they have to hoard whatever resources they've acquired, right? They also have all kinds of cognitive distortions about what's actually occurring and why it's occurring. And, just heavy, heavy trauma. And so my target audiences are folks on Capitol Hill, not too far from where I live, people in the tech industry, and then people in the healthcare field.
Gotcha. Yeah. I really appreciate that observation that you can't really provide effective leadership without resolving your own trauma and issues and becoming more embodied.
Yeah, I that's part of it. And also what I'm saying is that a more trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive approach allows us to be supportive of everyone, right? When shame is not looming so heavily in the room, because people can feel that. Like, even if you say, I'm coming here to do, an educational workshop and teach these doctors how to show up with their patients in a way that's not shaming and harmful, if you are still judging them, they can feel that, right? So related to what you just shared, that's part of the reason that it is important to heal your own stuff, because people can feel that.
Yeah.
On a very
Well, great. I think I'm out of questions.
Yeah.
This is really enjoyable.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling complete as well. We covered a lot of ground. I still feel like there's so much more that I want to talk about, but you know, um, this is only one of probably like my third ever uh, interview on topics related to integral and metamodernism. So perhaps in the future there will be more to come.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've got a lot of really great medicine to offer.
Thank you.
And yeah, and hopefully your work will impact those movements towards social justice, let's say.
I'm having a reaction to that because I don't know that I really see it as that. It's just about liberating human people, you know,
So you don't see it
liberating.
as social justice.
Yeah, I'm not really, that's not really part of my goal anymore. Not equality.
It's not to achieve justice.
It's to figure out together what we want to co-create when people are not so traumatized. When people are healed. Well,
And you were saying it's not about equality.
not really, it is about treating human beings with dignity, like in the case of the healthcare system. And learning really how to slow down and co-regulate. But that to me is different than social justice. Like the social justice stuff, there are a lot of folks doing that work of like teaching people, maybe to not make derogatory statements about someone's skin color or hair texture or body size. You know, those things are important too, but to me, that's what I think of when I think of social justice work. And I feel like I'm speaking about something kind of different.
All right, sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for your patience with me.
It was my pleasure.
Okay. Ciao.
So.